Sega rises authoritatively from its 8-bit grave on Segaiden episode 89.
I will be right here waiting for you.
Are you tired of hearing about Altered Beast yet? Well, sorry, because everything that has come up until now has just been appetizers for the main course. This is it, the entree. Because without Altered Beast, there is no Sega Genesis. Or, at least not in the US anyway. Sega of America included the game as the pack-in title for the console's initial release, and emblazoned the packaging for the system with Altered Beast visuals. Of course, this leads us to confront one of gaming's greatest paradoxes. Altered Beast is not, in the end, if we're being completely honest with one another, a particularly great video game. However, Altered Beast was the perfect game to include with the Sega Genesis system. Both things can be true.
Power up.
It's probably worth discussing at this point the phenomenon of pack-in games. They're a relic of a better, vanished time. These days, consoles simply don't ship with a full game included at the time of the system's debut. Publishers reserve that honor for post-launch bundles in order to drive sales, especially around the holidays. Sadly, brand new consoles don't simply not ship with a game in tow anymore, they actually charge you for the privilege of getting a tutorial. Once upon a time, however, no one would dare to ship a game system in the US without including a piece of software that players could enjoy on day one for no extra cost. This wasn't simply a good value proposition, it was also a way of idiot-proofing a console against clueless parents and grandparents who might make the well-intentioned choice to wrap a shiny new game system to, for example, put under the tree on Christmas morning without realizing that the actual software that makes the system worth owning has to be purchased separately, and that stores are closed that day and kids now own a very expensive gift that they can't use for another day or two, assuming that they can even afford to buy a game right now to begin with. This tradition goes all the way back to the Atari 2600, the world's first console to ship without games built in. Unlike dedicated Pong systems or even the Fairchild Channel F, the 2600 was a fully programmable device, meaning that it could only run games from a cartridge, as no software was built into the machine. And so Atari included a copy of Combat, fully gratis, with each system. This approach remained the standard for the US until the 32-bit era, when Sega and Sony got cheap with their consoles and just included demo sampler discs instead of full games with the Saturn and PlayStation. Bad as that was, Nintendo took that parsimony a step further, shipping the N64 as a bare-ass console with nothing playable in the box. Something that would have been unthinkable even a few years earlier. In the US, that is. In Japan, however, the concept of the pack-in never really found purchase. Bandai launched its unsuccessful Supervision 8000 system with a copy of Space Invaders Clone Missilevator in 1979, but after that, every console I've come across showed up at Japanese retail without a game in the box. Heck, I still remember my dismay the first time I visited Japan back in 2001 and discovered that Nintendo hadn't even included a video cable in the box for their exciting new GameCube. The concept of value for the dollar, or yen, has never really existed for game consoles in Japan the way that it has here. That was certainly the case for Sega's Mega Drive, which shipped, as all the other companies' other consoles had, as a standalone machine with games sold separately. But when the time came for Sega of America to localize Mega Drive, they did more than just change the system's name. They also made it a more appealing offer for the money by bundling a full cartridge in the machine's box. But which game to include? Sega shipped 6 games alongside the Genesis on day one in America. 2 brawlers, 3 shooters, and a sports title. Alas, none of those genres had the built-in universal all-ages appeal of contemporaneous Game Boy pack-in Tetris, and Sega lacked an obvious high-profile mascot character like Mario to lean on. Sorry, Opa Opa. So the question then became, which pack-in title best represented the Sega Genesis as a product and as an experience? In that sense, Altered Beast seems like the obvious answer. Ignore the fact that Altered Beast isn't actually much to speak of as a game. As a technical showcase, it absolutely, as the kids say these days, whips ass. Altered Beast wasn't the only arcade to Genesis port to appear on day one, but compared to Super Thunderblade and Space Harrier 2, it offered a more impressive adaptation. The other 2 conversions, well, Conversion and Conversion Sequel, originated on superscalar hardware, a platform that the Genesis could fake better than any other system on the market, but still couldn't recreate perfectly. Altered Beast, on the other hand, debuted on a System 16 board, something the Genesis could imitate with convincing fidelity. Was Altered Beast for Genesis a 100% perfect home conversion of the coin-op title? No, but it came close enough that only the most tedious nitpicker would have found fault with it back in 1989. Imagine being such a killjoy loser that you could see this on your own television, in your own home, in August 1989, and your only thought would be, boy, they need to tighten up the color design on level 3. Why even play video games at that point, man? The coin-op Altered Beast pushed the System 16 framework nearly to its limits in terms of visuals, with massive characters, cooperative play, cool effects, and memorable audio. All of those things appear in the Genesis version with, 90-95% fidelity? Nothing at the time came anywhere near this close to reproducing such a high-end arcade experience on a home system. Master System did its best with this material, bless its heart, but we've seen how that went. The older console managed to impersonate the general look of Altered Beast, which looked great in screenshots and ads, but in motion that version ended up being, to put it lightly, rough. The Master System couldn't handle nearly so many large sprites as Altered Beast required, so the programmers relegated most of its interactive elements to fake animated background graphics, resulting in a sluggish, choppy, unresponsive game. And even then, the Master System cart had to drop an entire stage, simplify the power-up cycle to 2 steps instead of 3, and abandon the 2-player cooperative elements altogether. And that was the best any existing console could do to replicate a System 16 experience. As for the NES, that was even sadder. The closest thing it could offer to Altered Beast was the so-called Big Mode of Predator, a simplistic auto-scrolling shooting experience that also relied heavily on the use of interactive background tiles in order to compensate for sprite display deficiencies. And unlike Altered Beast on Master System, the NES had to revert to blank, black backgrounds in Big Mode in order to allow those chunky characters to even exist on screen. The Genesis, on the other hand, rendered Altered Beast with style. The entire game fit into its cartridge. 2-player simultaneous combat across all of the stages, with all transformations and all the steps to get there preserved. The Genesis backgrounds actually added parallax scrolling that didn't exist in the arcade game. And if the color depth and audio quality suffered slightly in translation, those losses certainly weren't enough to get up in arms about. This was, quite simply, the closest thing to an arcade-perfect conversion anyone had managed to bring across to a console since, Namco released Pac-Man for Famicom in 1984? The Master System had done a bang-up job with System 1 adjacent releases like Wonder Boy, and even with some early System 16 titles like Fantasy Zone. But Altered Beast on Genesis blew them away in terms of accuracy. We're talking about a far beefier and more advanced piece of software here. In other words, Altered Beast definitively embodied Sega's sales pitch for Genesis. This is the place to go for the best-looking, most arcade-accurate game experiences to be found anywhere. Kind of like how the Master System had been, but like for real this time? Altered Beast represents a tidy little package that makes full use of everything in the Genesis box. From stereo audio support to justifying the inclusion of a second controller, it's the complete package. And that makes it a great pack-in title. But so does the fact that, again, if we're being honest, there just isn't a lot to Altered Beast. This is pure empty-calorie gaming. It looks and sounds great, plays smoothly, and even minimizes sibling squabbles by letting little brother or sister join in without needing to wait for player 1 to tap out for alternating play. However, you can power through the entire game in about 10 minutes if you know what you're doing. And once you do know what you're doing, there's not really that much variety to the replay experience. The bad guys always attack from the same places, the power-ups always appear at the same points, and you always need to reach peak power before arriving at the wizard dude so that he'll turn into a boss monster at the end of each stage. This version of the game uses something closer to the arcade's hit point value for bosses too, so you don't need to grind tediously seemingly forever against the big enemies the way that you did in the Master System release. In any case, the smoother action and more responsive controls make the final boss much less tiresome and frustrating to fight than the awkward, unending showdown on Master System. Anecdotally, it didn't take long for players to master Altered Beast and extract the maximum possible entertainment value from the game. It made a dazzling showcase for the new system, but it also had very little lasting power. Which means, of course, that new Genesis owners would quickly find themselves on the search for their next game. Not so great for players, perhaps, but a coup for Sega's accounting team. Like I said, Altered Beast was an appetizer, not the entree, designed to whet appetites, rather than give players a sense of satiation. A sales driver for the hardware, look what this machine can do, but also for software, since all of its best tricks were contained within the first 3 or 4 minutes of the game.
Welcome to your doom.
Once you had punched some monsters and made your huge brawler guy grow bigger and bigger until he exploded out of his clothes to become some sort of werewolf or were-dragon or were-bear or were-whatever, you've kind of played with everything there is to find in the Altered Beast toy box. It does take a little while to master the quirky controls, thanks to counterintuitive elements like needing to perform an overhead kick by ducking before you attack. And given Altered Beast's origins as a coin-op game, you absolutely need to commit a lot of the action to memory in order to avoid taking cheap hits when enemies spawn in places that make them hard to avoid, and to learn when their programming will make them behave in unexpected ways. But I mean, that's a pack-in game for you. Altered Beast is kind of the platonic ideal of a pack-in. It's cool enough to make you feel good about the new system you've purchased, it looks great in store demos, and it's not so substantial that you're content to let this be the sole entry in your library for long. In that sense, Sega demonstrated a much better business sense in identifying the ideal freebie for their console than Nintendo would when they joined the 16-bit fray. Super Mario World for Super NES would honestly be far too massive and involved a game to foster a healthy console ecosystem for Nintendo and its partners. In a way, it would have been smarter to ship Pilot Wings in the system's box and rely on Mario's familiarity and broad appeal to guarantee a near 1-to-1 attach rate for Super Mario World as a standalone cart. But maybe that's just a sign of how much headway Sega would make over the next 2 years with Genesis. Their 16-bit system would become entrenched enough by the time Super NES shipped that Nintendo was forced to use the nuclear option and dangle the most refined, complex, identifiable, and content-rich piece of software they had ever created to that point as a free bonus in order to entice Americans to select Super NES over Genesis. Which honestly makes it even funnier that Sega would then turn around and make that look like a drawback to the Super NES, comparing Super Mario World to Sonic the Hedgehog as a demonstration of how slow and boring Nintendo had become. I strongly disagree with that premise because Super Mario World is a legitimate masterpiece, but Sega made that line of propaganda work for them, and it's hard to argue with the results. In that sense, I suppose, Altered Beast and its brutish man-monsters also represented the overall Sega ethos quite accurately for this era. Sega had gone from the powerful but ultimately overwhelmed Master System to the shirt-bursting monster assault of Genesis. Suddenly, the company found itself in possession of some dangerous fangs it could bear, especially in its marketing department. It would admittedly take a little while for Sega's marketing to ramp up and become the force of rampaging terror that would ultimately define the 16-bit console wars. And that is why Sega Visions had nothing of substance to say about this version of Altered Beast. The Sega Challenge newsletter ended in late 1989 with a slim issue dedicated to Master System releases, and all that could offer in terms of Genesis promotion was a vague, "coming soon" teaser in the front of the magazine. The rebooted Sega Visions magazine wouldn't arrive until the summer of 1990, by which point Sega had much more interesting things to promote than the free pack-in cartridge that came with the console a year earlier. The gap between Sega Challenge and Sega Visions likely resulted from the interregnum in US distributors. Around the time that the Genesis launched, Sega clawed back its console distribution rights from the largely useless Tonka. And it seemed to take the company a little while to get all of its ducks in a row following that shift. This had the somewhat odd side effect of meaning that Sega first-party promotional publications leapfrogged the launch of their most important console ever. But then again, it probably took that year before the Genesis install base had grown large enough to support a paid subscription-only magazine. So it may be a while before Sega Visions has much of anything to say about the Genesis library. But we'll get there in due time, don't you worry. Next time on Segaiden, suddenly, the promise of arcade-perfect ports rings a little hollow.